At 10:47 in the morning on September 2nd, 2025, a 4-engine speedboat cut through Caribbean waters south of Trinidad, its bow lifting slightly as it maintained speed through moderate swells. The crew of 4 had no idea they were already dead. They did not know that 38,000 feet above them, a P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft had been tracking their vessel for the past 2 hours, feeding real-time coordinates into a network that connected satellites, warships, and combat aircraft across the entire Caribbean basin. They did not know that 70 kilometers to the northwest, an AH-1Z Viper attack helicopter had lifted off from the USS Wasp, its pilot receiving targeting data through a helmet-mounted display that painted the world in layers of information invisible to the human eye. And they certainly did not know that the decision to end their voyage had been made not by a judge, not through the slow machinery of international law, but by a commander operating under rules of engagement that treated them not as criminals but as combatants. Enemy fighters. Targets. 8.3 seconds later, the speedboat ceased to exist. The AGM-114 Hellfire missile is a weapon designed during the Cold War to destroy Soviet tanks. It weighs approximately 100 pounds, travels at speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour, and carries a 17-pound high-explosive warhead specifically engineered to penetrate armor before detonating. It uses semi-active laser guidance, meaning the launching platform paints the target with an invisible laser beam, and the missile rides that beam to impact with precision measured in inches, not feet. Originally fielded for Apache helicopters hunting armored columns, the Hellfire evolved into the most versatile air-to-ground weapon in the American arsenal. It has destroyed tanks in Iraq, obliterated insurgent positions in Afghanistan, and eliminated high-value targets through drone strikes that became synonymous with the War on Terror. But the Caribbean interdiction mission on September 2nd represented something fundamentally different. This was not a missile fired at an enemy soldier. This was not a strike against a terrorist. This was a weapon designed to kill armored vehicles, launched at a wooden speedboat carrying people who, under any traditional understanding of international law, were criminals engaged in smuggling. Not soldiers. Not combatants. And yet the missile was launched anyway. Under orders from the President of the United States. With full legal authorization from the Department of Defense. This was the moment American counter-narcotic strategy crossed a line it had never crossed before. The moment the war on drugs became an actual war. With missiles. With casualties. With rules of engagement written not by lawyers but by combatant commanders. The AH-1Z Viper is the most advanced attack helicopter in the United States Marine Corps inventory. It is a fully marinized aircraft, meaning every component has been designed to operate in salt-laden environments where corrosion and humidity test equipment to the breaking point. Its cockpit is dominated by digital displays that integrate data from multiple sensors, radar systems, thermal imagers, and external data links into a single coherent picture. The pilot and gunner wear helmet-mounted displays that project targeting information directly onto their visors, allowing them to designate targets simply by looking at them. The weapon's pylons carry a modular mix of ordnance including 20mm cannon ammunition, rockets, and AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. This is a dedicated weapon system optimized for killing ground targets with overwhelming firepower and surgical precision. And on the morning of September 2nd, it was being used to kill a speedboat. The P-8 Poseidon that provided targeting data is a Boeing 737 commercial airliner converted into one of the most sophisticated surveillance platforms in existence. It carries advanced radar systems capable of detecting surface vessels at extreme range, electronic intelligence suites that can intercept communications, and high-resolution cameras that can read hull numbers from altitudes where the aircraft itself is invisible to the naked eye. It can stay airborne for hours, building a complete picture of maritime traffic patterns, identifying anomalies, and tracking vessels of interest with relentless patience. In the context of Caribbean drug interdiction, the P-8 serves as the eye in the sky that sees everything. It watches vessels depart from Venezuelan or Colombian coasts. It notes when they turn off transponders, when they alter course to avoid known patrol routes, when they rendezvous with other vessels in patterns consistent with smuggling operations. And when sufficient intelligence indicates that a vessel is carrying narcotics and is operated by a designated terrorist organization, the P-8 hands off targeting coordinates to strike aircraft. The surveillance net is so comprehensive that by the time a smuggling boat reaches open water, it is already being tracked by systems the crew cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot evade. At 10:47 and 23 seconds, the Hellfire missile separated from the AH-1Z's weapons pylon with a sharp crack and a burst of rocket motor exhaust. The missile seeker head immediately acquired the laser designation painted on the speedboat by the helicopter's targeting pod. Guidance fins adjusted. The missile climbed briefly, then nosed over into a shallow dive, accelerating toward the target at velocities that gave the crew no chance to react. There was no warning. No radio call demanding surrender. No shots fired across the bow. No opportunity for the crew to raise their hands and submit to arrest. Just the missile, closing the distance in a trajectory calculated to maximize impact. At 10:47 and 31 seconds, the Hellfire struck the speedboat just after the center console. The warhead detonated on contact, converting 17 pounds of high explosive into a shockwave that ripped through wood, fiberglass, and human tissue with indiscriminate violence. The boat's fuel tanks ignited a fraction of a second later, adding a fireball that consumed everything within a 10-meter radius. Wreckage scattered across the water. The vessel broke apart and began sinking immediately. Of the 4 people aboard, none survived. The entire engagement, from missile launch to target destruction, lasted 8.3 seconds. And with that, the rules of Caribbean drug interdiction had fundamentally changed. President Trump announced the strike hours later, posting video footage to social media that showed an aerial view of the speedboat moving through calm waters, followed by a sudden flash, a mushroom of black smoke, and flames spreading across the wreckage. His accompanying statement identified the target as a vessel operated by Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang designated by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization. He claimed the boat was carrying narcotics intended for American shores and framed the strike as self-defense against an existential threat. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth echoed that framing in subsequent statements, declaring that the United States would treat cartel smugglers exactly as it had treated Al-Qaeda. Not as criminals to be arrested and prosecuted, but as enemy combatants to be hunted and killed. The legal justification rested on designations made in the preceding weeks. The Trump administration had classified multiple drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, a status normally reserved for groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. By redefining smugglers as terrorists, the administration argued it had the authority to use military force under the law of armed conflict rather than law enforcement protocols. On October 1st, Trump formally notified Congress that the United States was engaged in armed conflict with unlawful combatants in the Caribbean. That notification transformed what had been a law enforcement mission into a combat operation with rules of engagement that permitted preemptive strikes on suspected targets without warning, without arrest attempts, and without the judicial oversight normally required for lethal force against civilians. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some officials celebrated the strike as a decisive shift from ineffective interdiction policies that had allowed drug trafficking to flourish for decades. They pointed to statistics showing that traditional methods of boarding and arresting smugglers had done little to stem the flow of cocaine. They argued that cartels operated with military-level organization and inflicted violence on American communities comparable to acts of war. But human rights organizations, international legal experts, and several foreign governments condemned the strike as extrajudicial killing. They pointed out that the people aboard the speedboat had never been charged with crimes, never faced trial, and never had the opportunity to surrender. They noted that U.S. military forces had no jurisdiction in international waters to execute foreign nationals without due process. They questioned whether the designation of cartels as terrorist organizations was a legal fig leaf designed to circumvent international law prohibiting the use of military force against civilians engaged in criminal activity. Venezuela condemned the strike as an act of aggression. Colombia and other regional partners expressed concern that U.S. unilateral military action could destabilize the Caribbean and create a precedent for other nations to use lethal force outside their borders without international oversight. The technical execution of the strike was flawless. The Mi-8 maintained surveillance from an altitude that made detection impossible. The AH-1Z approached from the target's blind quarter, using sensors and data links to position itself for optimal firing geometry. The pilot used the helmet-mounted display to designate the target simply by looking at it, and the weapon system computed launch parameters automatically. The Hellfire tracked the laser designation with unwavering accuracy and detonated on impact with catastrophic effect. From a purely operational standpoint, the engagement demonstrated overwhelming technological superiority. A wooden speedboat with outboard engines stood no chance against a network kill chain that integrated space-based surveillance, airborne sensors, digital data links, and precision-guided munitions. The cost differential was staggering. The speedboat and its cargo might have been worth several $1 million. The Hellfire missile cost approximately $150,000. Operating costs for the aircraft added tens of thousands more. But from the Pentagon's perspective, the cost was irrelevant. The message was what mattered. The Caribbean is no longer a safe operating environment for drug smugglers. The United States now has the capability and the willingness to track, target, and destroy smuggling vessels with military force. In the weeks and months following the initial strike, the campaign expanded dramatically. By late December 2025, U.S. forces had conducted at least 29 strikes on 30 vessels, killing more than 105 people. The operations shifted from the Caribbean to the Eastern Pacific, where intelligence suggested cocaine routes from Colombia to Mexico were more active. MQ-9 Reaper drones became the primary strike platform. AC-130J gunships and fighter jets were also deployed. But the results were not always as clean as the September 2nd strike. Multiple sources confirmed that several early strikes required multiple missile hits to destroy target vessels. Wooden speedboats were more resilient than expected. Unlike armored vehicles, fiberglass and plywood hulls often absorbed explosive force without catastrophic structural failure. The boats burned but did not always sink quickly. Survivors sometimes jumped into the water, forcing U.S. forces to decide whether to rescue them or leave them to drown. In one confirmed case, 2 survivors were rescued and later repatriated. In most other cases, there were no survivors. The edited videos released showed only initial explosions and fireballs, creating the impression of instant obliteration. The reality was messier, more complicated, and far more morally ambiguous. The broader strategic question was whether these strikes actually reduced drug trafficking or simply displaced it. Proponents argue that cartel activity in the Caribbean declined sharply following the initial strikes, with fewer vessels attempting routes between Venezuela and the Eastern Caribbean. Intelligence reports suggested cartels were rerouting shipments through longer paths to avoid U.S. surveillance zones. Some organizations reportedly suspended operations entirely. But critics pointed out that cocaine production in Colombia had not decreased. Demand in the United States had not diminished. And the fundamental economic incentives driving the drug trade remained unchanged. Destroying boats killed smugglers and eliminated specific shipments, but it did not dismantle cartels, did not reduce coca cultivation, and did not address market forces that made trafficking profitable. The strikes were tactical successes but strategic failures. They created impressive videos, generated headlines, and demonstrated military capability. But they did not solve the drug problem. They simply made it more expensive and more dangerous for people directly involved in moving the product. The legal and ethical dimensions remain unresolved. Human rights organizations called for investigations into whether the strikes violated international humanitarian law, which prohibits military force against civilians not directly participating in hostilities. Reports indicated that local officials identified some victims as low-level fishermen, not senior cartel operatives. If true, that raised the possibility that the United States was killing people who posed no direct threat and whose involvement might have been coerced or misidentified. The Trump administration asserted absolute authority under the law of armed conflict, arguing that the United States has the inherent right to defend its citizens against deadly drugs. Defense Secretary Hegseth stated that 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses annually, justifying military force. President Trump repeated similar numbers, though the CDC reported approximately 80,000 overdose deaths in 2024, a 25% decline from the previous year. The discrepancy raised questions about whether the campaign was driven by genuine security concerns or political messaging. What cannot be disputed is that the technology worked. The kill chain functioned with ruthless efficiency. The Mi-8 detected targets at ranges that made evasion impossible. The AH-1Z and MQ-9 delivered ordnance with precision that turned the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific into monitored, lethal environments. The helmet-mounted displays, digital data links, and real-time targeting systems transformed what had been a cat-and-mouse game into a one-sided technological slaughter. Cartel speedboats could not outrun missiles traveling at supersonic speeds. They could not evade sensors that saw through darkness and distance. They could not avoid surveillance networks covering thousands of square miles simultaneously. The only defense was to stop operating entirely. And for many smuggling organizations, that was exactly what they did. At least temporarily. The September 2nd strike was not the first time the United States used military force in drug interdiction, but it was the first time it did so with explicit acknowledgement that targets would be killed rather than arrested. Previous operations involved Coast Guard vessels boarding suspicious boats, seizing contraband, and detaining suspects for prosecution. But those operations maintained the fiction that the goal was law enforcement, not warfare. The Hellfire strike shattered that fiction. It declared openly that the United States considered certain smugglers to be enemy combatants subject to lethal targeting without judicial process. And once that precedent was established, it became nearly impossible to reverse. The logic of escalation, once unleashed, is difficult to contain. And by December 2025, the campaign had expanded to include strikes in international waters far from U.S. territory, raising questions about whether any smuggling boat anywhere was now a legitimate military target. The strategic calculus was rooted in frustration. For decades, the United States had invested billions in counter-narcotics efforts with limited results. Interdiction rates hovered around 10%. Cartels adapted faster than law enforcement could respond, using submarines, drones, tunnels, and creative methods that rendered traditional tactics obsolete. The Trump administration concluded that a fundamentally different approach was needed. One that prioritized lethality over legality. One that treated smugglers as soldiers rather than criminals. One that leveraged overwhelming military superiority to create consequences so severe that potential smugglers would choose not to participate. The 8-second destruction of a speedboat was designed to send exactly that message. And to a certain extent, it worked. But the cost of that message, measured not just in dollars but in lives, legal precedents, and international relationships, is still being calculated. Because once you cross the line from law enforcement to warfare, once you start using missiles designed to destroy tanks against wooden boats carrying people who may or may not pose any direct threat, you enter territory where the rules are unclear, the consequences unpredictable, and the line between security and brutality becomes dangerously blurred. And that is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Caribbean interdiction campaign. The technology worked perfectly. The missile flew true. The target was destroyed. The video looked impressive. But whether any of that actually made Americans safer, whether it reduced drug availability, whether it dismantled cartel networks, whether it respected international law, and whether it set a precedent that other nations might follow to justify their own extrajudicial killings, those questions remain unanswered. What we know for certain is this. On September 2nd, 2025, 4 people aboard a speedboat in the Caribbean Sea died in an explosion they never saw coming. A missile designed to destroy Soviet tanks erased them from existence in 8.3 seconds. And the United States military declared that action legal, necessary, and effective. Whether history judges that decision as a turning point in the fight against drug cartels or as a dangerous escalation that sacrificed legal principles for the appearance of decisive action is a question that will not be answered for years. But the precedent has been set. The missile has been fired. And in the waters of the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, smugglers now know that the next time they set out from shore, they may never see land again. Not because they will be arrested, but because a machine in the sky, controlled by an operator they will never meet, has already decided they are a target. And in the new arithmetic of American drug interdiction, targets do not get trials. They get hellfire missiles. And 8 seconds later, they cease to exist. But here is the question that should keep every one of us awake at night. If the United States can designate drug smugglers as terrorists and kill them with missiles in international waters without trial, without arrest attempts, without judicial oversight, what stops any other nation from doing the same? What stops Russia from declaring Ukrainian grain shipments support terrorism and launching missiles at cargo vessels? What stops China from designating Taiwanese fishing boats as threats and destroying them with drone strikes? What stops any government with military capability from deciding that its enemies, whoever they define those enemies to be, are no longer entitled to due process or international law? Because once you establish that principle, once you normalize the idea that suspected criminals can be killed based on intelligence assessments rather than proven in court, you have opened a door that cannot be closed. You have created a world where military technology replaces legal systems, where surveillance networks replace investigations, and where 8 seconds of missile flight replaces years of judicial process.